The night was cold, the air thick with an uneasy stillness that seemed to press down on the quiet Chicago suburb. Behind a modest house with peeling paint and a cracked driveway, something unseen weighed heavy beneath the surface. Inside, the laughter of a man playing the clown for neighborhood children echoed faintly in the distance. But behind that painted smile, darkness thrived. John Wayne Gacy was no stranger to this neighborhood. To many, he was the affable contractor, a man who juggled civic duties and parties with ease. To some, he was a volunteer clown who entertained at local events, Pogo the Clown, they called him. But those who knew him less well felt a coldness lurking just beneath the surface. And beneath that surface, in the dank crawlspace beneath his home, something worse than fear was buried. It began with the disappearance of young men, teens and boys from working-class families. Some came from troubled homes, others were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Their names were whispered among friends, feared by parents who warned their children to stay close to home, to avoid strangers. But no one could have imagined what was truly happening behind the walls of Gacy's house. The first time the police knocked on his door, it was because a boy had vanished after last being seen near Gacy's home. The neighbors said they saw a man in a clown suit hours after the boy was reported missing. The police smiled politely, wrote their notes, and left. There was no evidence then, only a sense that something was wrong, but not yet dangerous enough to act. One night, a family waited at the edge of their seats, watching the clock crawl towards midnight. Their son had left the house earlier that day, promising to return by dinner. The phone did not ring. The door did not open. Hours passed, each minute heavier than the last. Meanwhile, John Wayne Gacy was preparing another mask, both literally and figuratively. His double life was a carefully constructed theater. By day, the businessman who mingled with politicians, hosted barbecues, and drove a bright red Cadillac. By night, the man who lured boys with promises of work, money, or just a friendly face, only to trap them forever. The weight of his duplicity grew heavier with each victim. Yet the man behind the clown's mask wore no visible cracks. His charm was practiced, his smile rehearsed. And yet, in the darkest hours, there was a coldness in his eyes, a void that no human connection could fill. For the victims, it began with simple trust, the kind born from desperation or hope. A ride home, a job offer, a kind word. That trust became their undoing. The house was a labyrinth of horror. The basement, sealed off from daylight, held the secrets no one wanted to believe. When police finally forced their way inside, they found a nightmare made real. Chains hung from the walls. Hidden crawlspaces revealed by loosened floorboards. The smell of decay. And in the cold, concrete floor, bodies concealed beneath layers of dirt and cement. Each discovery was a piece of a horrifying puzzle. Boys and young men stripped of their names and futures, reduced to the silence of death. But before the bodies, before the arrests, before the trial that would grip a nation, there were the lives. Robert Piest was one of those boys, a 15-year-old with dreams and fears like any other teenager. The last time he was seen, he had accepted a ride from a man named Gacy, a man who promised to help him find work. His disappearance sparked the investigation that would unravel a web of lies and murder. Families clung to hope even as fear crept in. The community was torn between disbelief and dread. How could a man so seemingly ordinary be capable of such evil? The media frenzy that followed painted Gacy as a monster, a clown-turned-killer. But beneath the headlines, the victims were more than just stories, they were sons, brothers, friends. Their laughter silenced, their future stolen. The trial was a grim spectacle. Gacy's calm demeanor as witnesses recounted horrifying details only deepened the chilling contrast between the man and his crimes. His defense tried to paint him as sane, coherent, even remorseful. But the evidence was undeniable. Psychologists who examined Gacy spoke of a fractured mind, one that blended charm with cruelty, affection with violence. They tried to understand how someone could lead a double life so perfectly, hiding monstrous impulses behind a mask of normalcy. As the verdict came down, a community held its breath. The man who had once been a neighbor, a clown, a businessman, was sentenced for the murder of 33 young men. But even after the courtroom drama ended, the scars remained. Families struggled to find closure. The public wrestled with the uncomfortable truth that evil can live next door, hidden behind a smile. John Wayne Gacy's legacy is not just the horror of his crimes, it is a haunting reminder of how fragile trust can be, how darkness can thrive in the shadows of everyday life. And the question lingers, how many more stories went untold? How many victims were never found? The basement may have been cleared, but the echoes of what happened there still haunt the neighborhood. And beneath it all, behind the painted smile, the mask never truly slipped. The house on Somerdale Avenue looked like any other on the block. White siding. A small porch. A neatly trimmed lawn. If you didn't know better, you might have thought a family lived there, someone's uncle, maybe. Someone who grilled on Sundays. Someone you could trust. Inside that house, the wallpaper peeled at the corners. The air was thick, heavy with something you couldn't name, only feel. And in the basement, beneath layers of dirt and lime, was a silence so absolute, it crushed every sound that dared enter. This is where it began to unravel. The first boy to disappear was Timothy McCoy. 15 years old. A quiet kid with wide eyes and calloused hands. He was just passing through, headed home after visiting family in Michigan. He never made it. Gacy said they met at the Greyhound bus terminal. Claimed Timothy offered to come over for a drink. Gacy said he woke up to see McCoy standing over him with a knife. That it was self-defense. That he killed because he had to. But the way he described it, years later, told a different story. He smiled. Said it was the first time he felt a total orgasm. Not just from sex. From death. From control. That moment, he said, changed everything. He buried Timothy's body in the crawlspace beneath the house. That was 1972. In the months that followed, the disappearances multiplied. Johnny Butkovich was 17. A tough-looking kid with a soft voice and a love for his car. He worked for Gacy briefly, doing odd jobs with his construction company. One day, after an argument over back pay, he vanished. His keys, wallet, and car were all found parked outside his house. His parents called the police. They mentioned Gacy. They begged them to look into him. The police shrugged it off. Then there was 16-year-old Samuel Stapleton. Vanished walking home from his sister's apartment. A few weeks later, 15-year-old Randall Reffitt disappeared too, his parents still holding out hope that maybe he ran away. Maybe he was with friends. Maybe it was nothing. It was never nothing. They were all beneath the house. Gacy had a system. He'd lure them in, sometimes with the promise of work, sometimes with drugs, alcohol, or just a ride. He'd show them a pair of handcuffs, make it seem like a game. It's a magic trick, he'd laugh. Watch this. Snap. Locked. Then came the rope. He called it his rope trick. A tourniquet made from thick white cord, twisted through a stick, turned slowly. Tightened until it silenced everything. Afterward, he'd drink. Sleep. Bury the body beneath the floorboards, inch by inch, corpse by corpse. No one suspected a thing. Because Gacy was always smiling. Always laughing. He was active in the community, hosted block parties, took photos with the local police chief while dressed as a clown. Pogo, he called himself. Kids loved him. So did their parents. No one saw what was rotting beneath his feet. But the smell was harder to ignore. Neighbors complained. Said it smelled like sewage. Like something had died under the house. Gacy blamed it on the moisture. On rats. On a busted pipe. And people believed him. Because that's what you do when monsters wear human faces. In March of 1977, a 19-year-old named William Kindred vanished. He told his girlfriend he was meeting Gacy for a drink. He never returned. She waited by the phone for hours, calling his friends, asking questions, retracing his steps. No one knew a thing. But the cracks were beginning to show. Later that year, Gacy had an employee named David Cram. Young, quiet, eager to work. Gacy invited him to stay at the house. One night, he tried the handcuff trick on David, told him not to worry, that it was just a joke. David got out. He left the next morning and never looked back. But he didn't go to the police. Not yet. By the time Robert Donnelly disappeared, Gacy had perfected the routine. He'd abduct, assault, then let them go. Robert was one of the rare survivors. He told police what happened, how Gacy had tortured him for hours, dunked his head in a bathtub, threatened him, laughed in his face. The police took a statement, and did nothing. No charges. No follow-up. Gacy was untouchable. Until December 1978. 15-year-old Robert Piest worked at a pharmacy in Des Plaines, Illinois. He was an honors student, a wrestler, and had plans to go to college. That night, he was supposed to head home after his shift. His mom was waiting in the car outside. But a contractor had come in earlier, offering teenage boys easy work for good pay. Robert told his mom he'd be right back. He never returned. This time, police took it seriously. They traced the contractor's name, John Wayne Gacy. A man with a criminal record. A man who, in 1968, had served time for sexually assaulting a teenage boy in Iowa. A search warrant was issued. Inside Gacy's house, they found a class ring, driver's licenses that didn't belong to him, a receipt for film developing that led straight back to Robert Piest. But it was the smell in the crawlspace that told them everything they needed to know. They brought in cadaver dogs. The dogs scratched the floor once, twice, then howled. The illusion was shattered. December 21st, 1978. The search team returned with shovels, gloves, and floodlights. The crawlspace entrance yawned open like a mouth, and one by one, they descended into it, not knowing what they were about to uncover, only that it would be worse than anything they had seen before. It started with a single bone. A human arm. Pale, bloated, embedded in the damp earth like a root system winding beneath the house. The first body was barely a body at all, half mummified, skin stretched thin over bone, a ragged rope still cinched tight around the throat. Just beneath it, another. Then another. And another. The soil had become a graveyard. The officers stopped counting at 10. The stench was unbearable. Not just of rot, but of time. A decade's worth of secrets pressed into the dirt like fossils. Some of the remains were intact. Others had decomposed into fragments, skulls split, teeth scattered, spines tangled like branches in a storm. They worked through the night, and into the next day. The crawlspace grew into a labyrinth of horror, marked not by rooms or walls, but by the arrangement of the dead. Gacy had buried them in layers, stacking one upon the other, hiding them like garbage. By the time the sun rose again, they had found 13 bodies. And they weren't finished. Word spread fast. News vans arrived. Crowds gathered behind police tape, their faces pale with disbelief. Neighbors wept. Reporters speculated. And parents, dozens of them, showed up with missing persons reports clutched in trembling hands. They all wanted the same thing. A name. A sign. A hope. Somebody knocked on the door of the temporary command center that day. A woman in her 50s. She held out a faded photograph of her son, Johnny Butkovich. He had disappeared 4 years earlier. She said she remembered that he once worked for a man named Gacy. She asked if that meant anything. The officer didn't answer. He just nodded once, slowly, and took the photo. Inside the house, they kept digging. The next day brought more bodies. Some still wore fragments of clothing, t-shirts, jeans, socks, even shoes. Many of them were gagged. Most had ligature marks so deep they had carved grooves into bone. One had cloth stuffed so far down his throat, it had turned to pulp. Another was found with plastic wrapped tightly around his face. They had died violently, alone, in the dark. 18. 19. 22. They stopped when the foundation became unstable. There was only so much space beneath the house. That's when Gacy confessed. He was sitting in an interrogation room, hands cuffed, eyes swollen from lack of sleep. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't try to lie. He just started talking. Slowly at first. Then in a flood. He said he killed 33 boys. 33. He told them about the rope trick. About the handcuffs. About the ones he threw into the Des Plaines River when the crawlspace got too full. He described where he met them: bus stations, parking lots, job sites. Some came willingly. Others didn't. But all of them died the same way. By his hands. He drew maps. Gave names when he remembered them. Some he didn't. Some were just the kid with the missing tooth, or the one in the red shirt. He said their faces haunted him. That sometimes he heard them in the walls. Then he laughed. They charged him with murder. 33 counts. And as they began the slow process of identifying the dead, the nightmare deepened. Each body told a story. Of a life cut short. Of a family destroyed. Of a boy who never came home. Gregory Godzik was 17. He loved working on cars and used to call his sister every night after dinner. One day he told his parents he was going to a job interview with a contractor named Gacy. They never saw him again. John Mowry was 19. A swimmer. Polite. Quiet. He lived with his parents. He told them he was going to a movie with friends. They found his wallet in Gacy's home. The youngest was Michael Marino. 14. And yet there were still victims they couldn't name. No dental records. No fingerprints. Just bones. It was like trying to reassemble a puzzle with half the pieces rotted away. But the families kept coming. They brought yearbook photos, school IDs, even baby teeth stored in old envelopes. They waited for hours in fluorescent-lit rooms while coroners showed them skulls and fabric samples and told them, gently, whether or not it was their child. And sometimes, it was. One mother fainted when they confirmed her son's jaw had been found. Another refused to believe it. She still came back every day, hoping they'd made a mistake. They never did. But to understand how a man like John Wayne Gacy became a harbinger of such horror, one must look beyond the crimes themselves, beyond the bodies beneath the basement floorboards, and step inside the fractured mind that orchestrated them. Gacy was, on the surface, a man who thrived on control. A man who crafted an image so carefully that it fooled not only neighbors and friends but also those closest to him. Yet beneath the polished veneer, his mind was a storm of contradictions, an unstable landscape where cruelty and charm collided. He was raised in a household marked by violence and intimidation. His father, a harsh and abusive man, instilled in young John a fear of weakness, a belief that power was survival. The scars left by those early years didn't fade, they festered, shaping his view of the world and his place within it. Psychologists would later describe Gacy's personality as deeply conflicted, on the surface, gregarious and outgoing, yet beneath, repressed rage and twisted desires. He longed for acceptance, for approval, but those needs were warped by fear and aggression. His public persona as Pogo the Clown was not just a costume, it was a mask worn to deflect suspicion, to bury the chaos inside. The clown was joyful, silly, and approachable. But behind the makeup was a man battling impulses he could neither control nor fully understand. In interviews and testimonies, Gacy exhibited a chilling calmness when describing his crimes. He minimized, rationalized, even deflected blame. This detachment baffled many. Was it cold calculation, or a fractured sense of reality? Experts later suggested that Gacy's behavior pointed to psychopathy, a personality disorder marked by superficial charm, lack of empathy, and manipulative tendencies. But even this clinical diagnosis could not fully explain the depth of his depravity. His victims were not faceless numbers but symbols of a tortured psyche. Young men who, in their vulnerability, became unwilling actors in a dark place scripted by a man driven by forces he barely controlled himself. Gacy's compulsions escalated over time. Each murder was an attempt to silence the voices inside, to assert power over a world that had, in his eyes, rejected him. The basement was his domain, where he could impose order on chaos, where the masks fell away and raw darkness reigned. Yet even as his crimes multiplied, fragments of guilt and fear occasionally pierced his armor. He took steps to conceal evidence, to evade capture, but never outpaced the growing suspicion surrounding him. The unraveling was slow, like a thread pulled taut until it snapped. As police closed in, cracks appeared in his carefully maintained facade. The man who had once commanded rooms with his presence now seemed smaller, desperate. But no confession came easily. When he finally spoke, it was with the same cold pragmatism that had marked his public life, detached, clinical, as if recounting events in a detached narrative rather than admitting to horrific acts. This chilling dissonance, between the man's outward charm and inner monstrosity, is what continues to haunt those who study his crimes. How does a person become so fractured? How does a smile hide such darkness? And even now, decades later, the questions linger, unanswered and unsettling. The answer, perhaps, lies in the fractured life of John Wayne Gacy, a man whose childhood was shaped by violence, confusion, and desperate yearning for acceptance. Raised under the iron fist of a brutal father, Gacy learned early that control was survival. But that control was twisted, warped into something monstrous. He built his life around appearances, meticulously constructing a persona that allowed him to slip unnoticed through the cracks. To the community, he was a dedicated businessman, a volunteer, even a jovial clown who entertained children at local events. But behind closed doors, behind the painted smile, a darker reality simmered, a mind tormented by impulses it could neither fully grasp nor resist. Psychologists later described Gacy as a man living in a dual world, one foot planted firmly in societal norms, the other lost in a shadowed realm of compulsions and cruelty. His charm was a mask, hiding a chilling detachment from the humanity of his victims. To him, they were not boys, but symbols, tokens of power and possession, each life a grim notch in his desperate attempt to silence the chaos inside. Meanwhile, above that basement where he imprisoned and killed, life moved on, or tried to. But for the families of those missing boys, the horror was only beginning. Days turned into weeks, then months, as hope faded and questions multiplied. Why hadn't their sons come home? What silence lay behind the unanswered calls, the unopened doors? The community rallied in fragments, vigilant neighbors, desperate parents, police piecing together threads of suspicion. Each new detail was a knife twisting deeper into hearts already shattered by fear and uncertainty. When the truth finally emerged, it was like a fracture splitting the town's very foundation. The discovery of bodies beneath Gacy's house shattered any remaining illusion of safety. For the families, it was a grief beyond words, a cruel confirmation of the worst nightmares realized. Yet, even as they mourned, some struggled to understand. How had this man lived among them, smiling and joking, while hiding such evil? How had the community's trust been betrayed so thoroughly? In court, Gacy's demeanor was unsettling, calm, collected, even cold. He spoke of his crimes with a clinical detachment that deepened the horror. His lack of remorse was a cruel echo of the pain inflicted on so many lives. Experts sought to unravel the mystery of his mind. Was it psychopathy? A fractured identity? The insatiable hunger for control born from childhood trauma? No single explanation sufficed. What emerged instead was a portrait of a man lost in darkness, his humanity eroded by years of repression and rage. But for the families, and the community, the trial was more than a legal proceeding, it was a long, painful reckoning. Each testimony reopened wounds. Each detail forced them to confront a reality they never wanted to face. Justice was served, but the scars remained, etched in memories, in empty rooms, in lives forever altered. The silence that followed was heavy, as if the earth itself refused to close over the horror buried beneath that quiet suburban street. And yet, even as time moved forward, the questions lingered. How many more had suffered unseen? How many stories were left untold? because some darkness never truly fades.